Slavery is often viewed as something of the past, but it remains a harsh reality in certain regions of the world today. Despite global efforts to eradicate slavery, it has taken newer and more sinister forms in the hands of extremist jihadist terrorist groups. These organizations, such as ISIS and Boko Haram, have exploited vulnerable populations, taking hostages to engage in human trafficking, forced labor, and forced sexual slavery. Slavery in the Middle East and Africa dates all the way back to the 7th century CE, and slavery has been a key revenue generator, fueling operations and personal enrichment of various corrupt groups in the Middle East throughout history. For example, the trans-Saharan slave trade started well before the Ottoman Empire. It began shortly after the rise of Islam and the establishment of Islamic caliphates in North Africa, particularly the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates between years 661 CE and 1258 CE. These early Islamic empires played a significant role in developing trade routes across the Sahara Desert, linking sub-Sahara Africa with North Africa and the broader Islamic world. For centuries, a network of trade routes across the Sahara Desert facilitated the transport of black African slaves to North Africa and the Middle East. The Zanj rebellion from 869 to 883 CE was a major uprising against the Abbasid Caliphate by black slaves working in the salt marshes of southern Iraq. This rebellion lasted for 14 years and reflected the brutal conditions faced by enslaved Africans in the Middle East at that time. The Ottoman Empire was then founded in 1299 CE, and it was one of the largest and most powerful empires in history. Its involvement in the slave trade was extensive, lasting from the 14th century until the empire's decline in the early 20th century. Slavery was a significant part of the Ottoman society, serving economic, political, and military purposes. It encompassed Europeans, Africans, and Asians, all of whom were enslaved under varying conditions. Now, the Ottoman Empire played a significant role in the history of slavery in the Middle East. Slavery was an integral part of the empire's economy and society. Now, as we discussed, the Ottoman Empire was involved in the Arab slave trade, importing slaves from Africa. These African slaves were referred to as Zanj and were used in a variety of roles, from agricultural laborers to domestic servants. Many African slaves were taken to Ottoman provinces such as Egypt, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. The trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trade also funneled millions of African slaves into the Ottoman Empire. Historians estimated that between 11 to 14 million Africans were traded through the trans-Saharan slave trade routes between the 7th century and 19th century, many of whom ended up in the Ottoman Empire. But another example of slaves is the enslavement of Europeans. The Ottomans also engaged in the enslavement of European Christians, particularly from the Balkans and Mediterranean regions. It is estimated that the Ottoman Empire enslaved between 1 million and 2.5 million Europeans during its rule, primarily through the capture of Christians from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean during wars and raids. These slaves were often taken as prisoners of war, forced into labor, or used as household servants, concubines, and soldiers, including janissaries. There was also something called the Devshirme system. This was a practice in which Christian boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers or bureaucrats for the empire. While the system offered some social mobility for those who were taken, it was still a form of forced servitude. Under this system, it is approximated that 300,000 to 500,000 Christian boys were taken from their homes in the Balkans, converted to Islam. There were also capture of Jews during wartime. Jews were sometimes captured during the Ottoman conquests, particularly during wars against other Christian powers. For example, during the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, Jews living in territories contested between the Ottomans and the Venetians were sometimes taken as captives by Ottoman forces. In the Mediterranean, during periods of piracy and conflict, Jews, along with Christians and Muslims, were sometimes taken captive and sold into slavery. North African pirates, who were often operating at the orders of the Ottoman Empire, frequently raided European coastal towns, capturing Jews and Christians alike to sell into slavery in the Middle East and North Africa. For example, during the 17th century and 18th century, the Jewish communities in coastal cities like Livorno, Italy, and other Mediterranean regions were targeted by those pirates. The Ottoman Empire's involvement in the slave trade was not just a societal or cultural phenomenon, it was a significant economic driver that bolstered the empire's wealth and power. But what about the financial details of the Ottoman slave trade? The Ottoman economy was heavily reliant on slavery, especially as the empire expanded across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Slaves were considered valuable assets, and the empire profited directly from capturing, selling, and taxing the trade. Slaves could fetch high prices at markets, particularly for specialized skills or beauty. African slaves were, for example, very valued as household servants or laborers, while Europeans and Caucasian slaves were often sold into military service or administrative roles or as concubines, especially those from Circassia were highly valued in elite circles, with prices sometimes equaling what would be hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's terms. The Ottoman slave trade also generated exorbitant revenue. While exact numbers are difficult to quantify due to the historical nature of the trade, some estimates suggest that slavery contributed significantly to the Ottoman economy. The trade involved millions of slaves over the centuries, and scholars estimate that the empire could have seen revenues equating to billions of dollars in today's currency from the sale and taxation of slaves. Well into the 20th century, slavery persisted in the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in the Gulf states. The abolition of slavery in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries only occurred in 1960, illustrating the lingering presence of the institution in the region. Although formal abolition of slavery occurred in many Middle Eastern areas in the early 20th century, even after abolition, major black market practices of that same slave trade still continue today. However, then came the rise of jihadist terrorism, which can be traced back to political and social upheavals in the Middle East and North Africa in the late 20th and early 21st century. These destabilized regions provided fertile ground for terrorist groups to rise to power and exert control over large populations. Using a distorted interpretation of religion to justify their actions, the combination of political instability, weak governance, and extremist ideology has fueled the rise of modern-day slavery within these terrorist groups. The resurgence of this brutal practice within jihadist terrorist organizations highlights the persistence of deeply rooted ideologies that manipulate religion and promote cultural divides for profit and power. Now, it's important to say that historically jihadists have misinterpreted and distorted Islamic teachings to justify the enslavement of those they deem infidels or enemies. These practices were resurrected despite Islam's rejection of such practices at the true core of the religion, because sadly there are terrorists who are trying to manipulate the religion and its teachings in order to control others. These modern-day slavery practices impact a broad array of ethnic and religious communities, often targeting minorities that lack protection from government forces. Extremist jihadist groups engage in a variety of methods to enslave vulnerable individuals. Many of these tactics are akin to the transatlantic slave trade that defined previous centuries. For example, abduction and forced labor. In areas controlled by jihadist groups, men, women, and children are often abducted during raids in villages and towns. Men are typically forced into labor, building infrastructure, or serving as forced soldiers, while women and children are exploited as domestic workers or subjected to sexual violence, and sometimes children are even forced into being child soldiers. Now, sexual slavery and forced marriage is also very rampant, a particularly abhorrent practice among extremist jihadists. Groups like ISIS openly marketed women from minority groups as sex slaves in their propaganda materials. They legitimize this practice by distorting religious texts, using women's bodies as weapons of war to further their cause. The emotional and psychological toll on the victims is immeasurable, often resulting in trauma that lasts longer after their physical release. Children are often seen as easily malleable and are prime targets for jihadist groups. Extremists force boys into becoming soldiers, bombers, or spies, and the trauma of violence and indoctrination scars them for life, leaving little hope for rehabilitation, while young women who are basically still children are also forced to become sex slaves or other domestic workers. A prime example of this is ISIS's enslavement of the Yazidis. The Yazidis is a Kurdish-speaking religious minority in northern Iraq, and they have been particularly targeted by ISIS. In 2014, ISIS fighters stormed into the ancestral homeland of the Yazidi religious minority in northern Iraq, Sinjar region, and launched what authorities have referred to as a genocidal campaign. Thousands of men and boys over the age of 12 were summarily killed after being given the ultimatum to either convert to Islam or die. It is estimated that between 7,000 to 10,000 women and girls were enslaved and subject to brutal abuses. These women were sold into sexual slavery, raped, and forced into marriage with ISIS fighters. But even as wives, they are still enslaved, often chained up and covered head to toe in burqas, subject to rape, forced labor, and abuse. Many of these women still remain unaccounted for. Now, there's also enslavement of Christians by ISIS and other extremist jihadist groups in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Christians were often given the choice to either convert to Islam or pay a jizya tax that was imposed on non-Muslims, or face execution or enslavement. For example, in Mosul, ISIS demands such a tax from Christians under a threat of slavery or death, forcing many to flee their homes. Targeting of Shia Muslim communities is also rampant. Extremist jihadist groups like Boko Haram and ISIS have attacked Shia Muslim and Christian populations in Africa, considering them heretics. In Nigeria, Boko Haram is an extremist jihadist group, and they have abducted thousands of women and children, forcing many into slavery. The infamous 2014 kidnapping of 276 Chibok schoolgirls is just one example of Boko Haram's tactics, where young girls were taken to be sold into sexual slavery or forced marriages. 100 of those children still remain missing to this day. Boko Haram has also used male captives for forced labor, and estimates suggest that Boko Haram has abducted at least 20,000 people in Nigeria since 2009 alone, though many more have been abducted that are not accounted for. Recent reports indicate that these abductions have intensified, with hundreds of children being kidnapped in various attacks since early 2024. In one of the more alarming incidents, Boko Haram, along with other armed groups, kidnapped 287 students from a school in Kaduna State in March 2024. This event underscores the ongoing security crisis in the region, where both Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa Province, also known as ISWAP, have been actively recruiting and exploiting children. These children are often forced into combat roles, with many being used in direct hostilities or support functions such as carrying ammunitions or cooking for the fighters. Girls in particularly are frequently subjected to sexual slavery. The Nigerian army has noted that Boko Haram, facing depletions in their ranks due to military operations and defections, have ramped up efforts to recruit more children, taking advantage of their vulnerability and lack of security in many areas. Now, the Islamic State West Africa Province is a splinter group of Boko Haram that has spun off and formed a separate terror organization, also engages in the very same tactics to enslave African women and children. The situation remains dire, with humanitarian organizations calling for increased protections for children and more robust efforts to secure their release and reintegration into society. The use of children by these extremist groups not only violates international laws, but also perpetuates the cycle of violence and instability in the region. In addition to ISIS, Boko Haram, and ISWAP, the Houthis have also engaged in similar activities. The Houthis are a terror organization that is backed by the corrupt Iranian regime. The Houthis have been accused of kidnapping and unlawfully detaining thousands of individuals, including journalists, activists, and members of religious minorities. These detentions are often used to silence dissent, extract ransoms, or leverage negotiations. Reports indicate that detainees are frequently subjected to torture and inhumane conditions. The Houthis have been widely criticized for enslaving and kidnapping children to use as child soldiers in their military campaigns as well. According to various reports, the Houthis have forcibly recruited children as young as 10 years old, sending them to the front lines to fight or to perform support roles. This practice has been condemned by international organizations as a grave violation of children's rights. There are also reports of forced labor in Houthi-controlled areas, particularly related to their civil war efforts as they try to conquer Yemen. Yemeni civilians, including children, are sometimes forced to support the Houthi military activities such as digging trenches, transporting supplies, or even building fortifications. The Houthis have also been accused of persecuting religious minorities, particularly members of the Baha'i faith. In some cases, this persecution has involved arbitrary detentions, tortures, and forced conversion attempts. Iran's corrupt regime plays a significant role and controversial role in the Middle East by funding and supporting terrorist proxy groups that further its geopolitical aims. While Iran does not openly engage in or condone this slave trade, it provides backing to militant groups that have been implicated in acts of terror and human rights abuses, some of which include forms of enslavement. Now, the Iranian regime's involvement in the region by empowering destabilizing actors such as these terror organizations indirectly perpetrates these environments where modern-day slavery can thrive. Extremist groups often take advantage of weakened state structures and chaotic war zones to expand their operations, including human trafficking and forced labor. This is in addition to the gross human rights violations that the Iranian regime subjects its very own civilians to in Iran, which is perhaps a subject for an entirely separate video. Treatment of Black people by extremists is also something to be concerned about. In fact, treatment of Black people by extremist jihadist groups often reflects a racial hierarchy in which Black individuals are dehumanized and subjected to particularly brutal treatment. One stark example of this is the use of the term abed in Arabic, which means slave, and they use this term to refer generally to Black people. They just refer to them as abed. And ISIS militants have been known to treat Black individuals from sub-Saharan Africa with extreme brutality. The term abed is used as a racial slur to degrade Black people, reflecting a deeply ingrained racist ideology among some jihadist factions. For instance, Black African migrants captured in ISIS in Libya were frequently enslaved, forced into labor, and subjected to worse conditions than Arab captives. Sometimes African slaves come to get work in certain countries, and then they are employed by local terrorists who take away their passports so they can't flee, and then they are subject to torture and forced labor at the hands of those people who were once their employers but now become their captors. The mistreatment of Black people by jihadists echoes the legacy of the Arab slave trade, where Black Africans were historically enslaved and brought to the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of the Islamic world. The dehumanization of Black people as abed persists in some extremist Arabic circles where racist attitudes still justify enslavement. The discrimination against Black people is not confined to ISIS or Boko Haram. Racism exists within the ranks of other jihadist and extremist groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, and it extends to certain societal practices in areas they control. For example, in Gaza, controlled by Hamas, Black Palestinians have faced discrimination. Gaza's Black community, known as the Afro-Palestinians, often face exclusion and segregation. Reports have documented that some Black Palestinians are segregated into poorer areas with the name of Abed. They face social exclusion and derogatory attitudes from other Palestinians who may view them as inferior. This reflects a broader historical prejudice in the region that sees Blackness as synonymous with servitude. This prejudice is rooted in the legacy of the Arab slave trade, where Africans were historically seen as inferior or slaves in the Arab world. And then we have Hezbollah. Though Hezbollah's primary focus is on anti-Israel militancy and regional influence, there have been reports of racist attitudes within the groups, particularly against African migrant workers in Lebanon. Many of these workers, who are often Black, face abuse and are treated as second-class citizens by segments of society, including members of Hezbollah, reflecting broader regional racism. Now let's talk numbers. The United Nations and other human rights organizations have estimated that jihadist groups like ISIS made millions of dollars from the sale of Yazidi women and children alone. At the height of its power, ISIS alone reportedly generated as much as $30 to $40 million from human trafficking annually. Slave markets were established in areas under ISIS control, with women being sold for as little as $50 to $200 depending on their age and appearance. Experts estimated that ISIS alone could have controlled 20 to 30% of the slave market in areas under its rule, reflecting the scale of its operation compared to traditional trafficking networks. Boko Haram has also profited from human trafficking. Ransoms for the release of abducted individuals, forced marriages, often for dowries, and the exploitation of captives for free labor all contribute to the group's revenue streams. These groups also use slavery to recruit fighters, sometimes offering women and girls as rewards to male recruits or soldiers, further incentivizing participation in their ranks. The global slave trade, including forced labor and sexual exploitation, generates an estimated $150 billion annually, according to the International Labor Organization. As for jihadist groups like ISIS and Boko Haram, their control of trafficking in conflict zones makes them highly influential players in these regional black markets. Their involvement increases the scale of suffering and perpetuates the global issue of human trafficking. Now, beyond specific acts of enslavement by jihadist groups, these organizations often operate within or alongside broader human trafficking networks that smuggle and exploit individuals across borders. For instance, in Libya, where ISIS had a strong presence, migrant detention centers have been revealed as sites of forced labor and sexual slavery. It is estimated that between 700,000 and 1 million migrants are trapped in Libya, many at risk of enslavement by militias or traffickers, some of whom have ties to jihadist groups. By controlling human trafficking routes and slave markets, jihadist groups gain economic power that extends beyond simple profiteering. they can sustain operations without relying solely on external funding. This economic self-sufficiency makes them much more dangerous and resilient, as they are less reliant on foreign donors or traditional forms of financing. The profitability of slavery has helped these extreme jihadist terror groups not only to finance their terror campaigns, but also to assert dominance over local populations and to increase their power. By profiteering from human misery, these groups have created self-sustaining economies that reinforce their ideological agendas and military capacities and help them recruit more terrorists. The promise of financial gain and access to slaves has become a powerful recruitment tool for jihadist groups. Many young men, especially those from impoverished or destabilized regions, are lured into extremism and terrorism by the financial benefits, which far exceed what they could earn in legitimate employment elsewhere. Among jihadist groups, fighters are often highly compensated compared to the impoverished populations around them, making terrorism one of the more lucrative professions in some of these regions. For example, at the height of its power, ISIS reportedly paid its fighters $400 to $1,200 per month, depending on rank, experience, and family size, which was far higher than the average income for civilians in war-torn areas. This was often supplemented by additional benefits such as looted goods, homes, and access to enslaved women. ISIS also built a diverse economy that includes not only slavery and human trafficking, but also oil sales, taxation, extortion, and looting. At its peak in 2015, ISIS was generating an estimated $1 billion annually, with human trafficking contributing a significant portion of that income. ISIS's financial strategy was diverse, but human exploitation was an integral part of their revenue model, especially in regions where traditional economies had collapsed. On a societal level, the presence of modern-day slavery perpetuates cycles of violence, poverty, and instability. Communities devastated by abductions and enslavement face long-term economic setbacks. Moreover, the normalization of human trafficking and forced labor in areas controlled by extremist terror groups undermine global efforts to promote human rights and equality. The economic power gained by these extreme terror groups, combined with their extremist ideology, enables jihadist groups to continue to destabilize large regions of the world. If you're interested in seeing more videos related to finance, the economy, and the dark world of money, be sure to subscribe to my channel. You should also watch this next video over here, which YouTube thinks you're really going to enjoy. Thank you guys all so much for watching.